Some of you might remember Teresa, who was with us, and her husband. They moved back to America, and Teresa posted this on her Facebook page. I think she was in the process of setting up their new house and trying to figure out where to put furniture. And so this was her saying, for Americans, this will make a lot of sense. If you come from a place that doesn't have a lot of squirrels, it might not make as much sense. But this is what it says. The road to life is littered with squirrels who could not make a decision. If you come from a place with a lot of squirrels, they're always running back and forth across the road, and half the time they stop in the middle of the road. And they're like jumping around, which way do I want to go, and which way do I want to go? And of course, sometimes they don't go anywhere, okay, because the car and that's the end of the squirrel. It happens where there's lots of squirrels because they can't make a decision. And so, I mean, repeatedly in America, when you're driving, you got to drive slowly. What is that squirrel? I mean, it happens here with pigeons, and then the pigeon tries to run away from your car, and I want to say, you can fly, what's wrong with you? But with squirrels, they can't decide where to go, okay? They're in two minds. And so I want you to keep that in mind, the problem of not being able to know which way you're going, as we look at some stories or an incident at the end of the Gospel of John. When we started this series, we kind of called this the story of stories, and we're looking at the story of Jesus, which is really the story of God. Okay? And John tells a particular story of Jesus in order to communicate something about the story of God, and it's the story of stories. Okay? It's the one story that's going to explain all the other stories. It's the stories, I'm going to try to argue, that will make possible other stories. The story of Jesus, the story of the Gospel of John, doesn't eliminate other stories. It doesn't eliminate your story. The story of Jesus is going to make your story possible. Your story can be affirmed in the story of Jesus. I'm having problems here. Okay. I think my battery is weak. There we go. If you notice on our Facebook page, Giannis created a really kind of a funky image that I think Kaiva was a little bit worried it was a bit creepy, but it was like this two-faced person turning her head, because we're going to talk about this story of 3 people in 5 minds. Okay, and as we're going to see, several people in this story are going to be in 2 minds. At least one of the people in this story is going to be single-minded. But it is a story of a number of people who are in 2 minds. They're not single-minded, and you can sense their discomfort in the way that John tells this story. I mean, he has interesting ways of communicating how uncomfortable it is for these people to be in these 2 minds, and how desperate it is for them to try to figure out what they're going to do. And it's the story, actually, of the crucifixion. Okay, I'm really having interesting times here. In John 18 and 19. So if you have a Bible with you, we're going to start at John 18. And we're going to look at some big incidences in 2 chapters in the Gospel of John, but the story of the crucifixion. Of course, if you've been in church, much of your life, you know the basic story. It's at least one Bible story that is easily pictured. I mean, anywhere in Latvia, almost anywhere, you can see people with the crucifix, earrings, necklace, in different regions of Latvia, they're often put up. And so there's something going on there with someone who was crucified. So at least that much of this story, and probably many of you know more details of the story. But it starts this way in John 18. It picks up where we left off at the end of spring when we finished our series on Jesus' farewell discourse. Jesus spent 3 chapters in the gospel telling his disciples what their life is going to look like when he leaves them. And then John chapter 17, he prays for his disciples. And then right after that, it says this: when Jesus had finished praying that prayer, he left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley outside of Jerusalem. And on the other side, there was a garden. And he and his disciples went into this garden. Now Judas, who also had been one of his disciples, of course, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So this was the plot of Judas. He had decided to betray Jesus for whatever reasons. It's not completely clear what all was going on in his mind. And what the officials in Jerusalem needed is someone who would help them to arrest Jesus at a private place. And this is what Judas provided them, this kind of private place away from the crowds where they could come and arrest Jesus. Okay, so Judas came to the garden, and he was guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. And they were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. So probably a fairly big group. Apparently there were some Roman soldiers there, and then more or less the temple police, who were sort of a police force in Jerusalem. So some of that force, and then other people who probably just wanted to be, part of the excitement. Something is going on. People are carrying torches. Let's go. And so this group of people have come to the garden, led by Judas, to arrest Jesus. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him. And this is a key phrase, and John has said this a number of times already. Beginning of John chapter 13, several times says, Jesus, knowing what's going to happen, therefore Jesus did this. And Jesus, knowing that was going to happen. Jesus knows he's going to be arrested. Okay, so this is the picture. Here's this mob coming to arrest Jesus, and he knows it, and here's Jesus' opportunity to go the other way. He could get out of this garden. Presumably the wall wasn't so tall that he couldn't climb over it. It would have been easy for Jesus to escape. Jesus knows they are coming, and he walks toward it. He goes out to this crowd. He goes to meet these people. He walks toward this destiny. He is focused on this. So just keep that in mind. We're going to return to the part of Jesus in the story, but it begins with the one character here who is absolutely single-minded, knows exactly what is happening, and is intentionally going toward this destiny. So that's Jesus. So Jesus gets arrested. He's first taken to the religious leaders. We're not going to look at those details. And there's a kind of trial before the religious leaders in which they are making accusations and so forth. But then when dawn comes, the religious leaders now are going to take Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor, because they want Jesus dead. This is why they've arrested Jesus. But they don't have the authority to kill Jesus. They need the power of the Romans to do that. And so they take Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, early in the morning to get him to condemn Jesus. That's, coming early in the morning was fairly typical. From what I've read, Roman officials, they would work kind of from dawn until about 10 in the morning. Their working day started very early, then at 10 they were done. Wouldn't that be nice if your working day ended at 10 in the morning and you had the rest of your day to do whatever you wanted? But in any case, so that was more or less normal, that Pilate was probably already awake and ready to work, and his first item on his agenda on this Friday morning was this guy Jesus being brought to him. And there's a lot of details in the interaction between Jesus and Pilate, but this is what's interesting about the way that John portrays this sort of trial or dialogue that Jesus has with Pilate, or that Pilate has with Jesus and with the Jewish officials. So Pilate is in his kind of quarters where he's doing his work. Because it's a special day coming up, the Jewish people don't want to come in, the Roman headquarters, because then they won't be able to participate in the festival. Okay, so they're concerned about, we want to be ritually pure so that we can be part of this festival that's going on and this special Sabbath that's coming up. So they don't want to go in. And so it says that Pilate, one of the rare times Pilate was being a little bit sensitive, he goes out to them and he listens to their accusation about Jesus. So Pilate goes out. Here's what they have to say. Then it says he goes back in to talk to Jesus. But then it says he has got to go back out to talk to the religious officials. Then he goes back in. Then it says he goes back out. Then he goes back in. And then he goes back out. At least 7 times, Pilate is going back and forth between Jesus and the religious leaders. Okay? I mean, here's the Roman governor, and he doesn't know what to do with this situation. He's caught between these hard places, and he's double-minded, and he's doing this, and he's doing this, and he's got to somehow make sure these guys aren't too upset with him, because he's already received bad reports. His job is threatened. The Roman emperor is not necessarily happy with Pilate at this point in Pilate's career. He's done some stupid things, and he's been rebuked by the emperor. He hates these people, the religious leaders, but he kind of has to keep them happy. And he's trying to figure out how to do that, and he's also interacting with Jesus. And he very quickly realizes that Jesus is not like anyone else he's ever met. And he knows that Jesus is not guilty of what he's been accused of being guilty of. Okay. The religious leaders mainly want to kill Jesus because for religious reasons, but they can't do that, so they also make this political charge that Jesus is like a rebel. He's a king. He's a threat to the Romans. Pilate discovers he's not really a threat. He's not that kind of king. I mean, ultimately, you know, the church is going to threaten the Roman Empire. You know, but Pilate doesn't understand that kind of threat. He understands that Jesus is not the kind of king that's a threat to the Roman Empire. And he realizes Jesus is innocent. And he wants to let Jesus go. But he's got to keep these people happy. And so he's constantly doing this back and forth, back and forth. He's trying to appease these people, trying to let Jesus go. And he's scared. I mean, again, his job is threatened. And eventually, in a few years, you know, the Roman Empire is going to recall him and he's going to lose his job. And there's really, history says pretty much nothing good about Pilate. You know, his story did not end so well. Most of what we know about him was what his interaction with Jesus and some other stupid things that he did to the Jewish people. That's Pilate. And he's trying to figure out his way, and he's not a man enough for this circumstance. And he's basically lost. Back and forth, back and forth. So one of the things that he'll do is he'll have Jesus beaten. Not the really bad beating that you often see on the films about Jesus, when after Jesus is already condemned, then he's going to be nearly killed with the whipping. But he just has, you know, his men beat Jesus, and then he takes Jesus out and says, here's your king. Look, I've punished him. Isn't that enough? He's hoping that by punishing Jesus a little bit, all this mass of people are going to say, okay, that's enough. Okay, we understand. You punished Jesus. We wanted something bad to happen to Jesus. That's okay. That's what Pilate is hoping for. That didn't work at all, because when he brings Jesus out like that, that's when they start to shout, crucify him, crucify him. And now Pilate is in really bad shape. He knows Jesus is innocent. He knows he ought to be set free. Roman justice should set Jesus free. But again, Pilate is just not strong enough to do that. And then the Roman, or the religious leaders say, you know, he claimed to be God. And this really scares Pilate, you know, because, you know, from his culture, they believed in these kind of divine men, you know, extraordinary humans that aren't purely human. I'll let Christians get out, so I hope it wasn't that bad of a sermon. Sorry. So Pilate is actually thinking again, who is this Jesus? Is it possible there is actually something divine about him? Again, because Pilate has recognized there's something about Jesus that is different. I mean, Jesus is standing here quite single-mindedly, completely and utterly in control of himself. Pilate, the governor, is desperate. I mean, it's just an amazing picture. He's desperate, trying to figure out what to do, and here's Jesus, completely in control of himself, completely single-minded. You'd almost want to say he's at peace, even though he knows what's coming up. And Pilate is desperate. And now he's scared, because what if he kills a guy who's kind of divine also? What kind of, deep pit is Pilate putting himself in? So that's Pilate. He's very double-minded. He's trying to win in this situation, and it's a no-win situation for him. Even at the very end, when he's finally realized he's got to condemn Jesus, and Jesus is crucified, he puts up on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Of course, the religious leaders don't like that, and they come to Pilate and say, no, don't write that. Say, he said he was King of the Jews. And Pilate's like, nah, what I've written, I'm not. That's his kind of little petty, childish way of getting back at them. He's become like a little child, kids arguing on the playground. That's what Pilate has become. Because he's not strong enough, he's not man enough to be single-minded and do the right thing. So nothing ends well with Pilate's part of the story. And all he is guilty of confirming this condemnation of Jesus and letting his men crucify him. So I should have put up that picture of poor Pilate. But the other character, before we get to Jesus, is Peter. Because Peter has a small but significant role in this story. And once again, it's a part of the story that you're probably familiar with. And it's when Peter denies that he's a disciple. In fact, denies that he even knows Jesus. So Jesus is arrested. Poor Peter. He actually tried to do the right thing. Often Peter isn't given credit. When Jesus is arrested, he actually pulls out his sword and tries to defend Jesus. I'm not sure I would do that. None of the other disciples did. But he actually tried to use a sword to defend Jesus. There was some courage in Peter's heart. But he's still just Peter. He's still just Peter. And he had earlier said, "Oh, I'll die with you, Jesus." Jesus said, no, you won't. And so that failure on Peter's part happens here. So Peter follows along with another disciple who is known to the high priest, and they follow behind this group. And when Jesus is taken to the home of the high priest for this sort of trial that happens there, Peter ends up inside of the courtyard with this other disciple. The girl on duty in this courtyard, probably when the other disciple brought Peter in, said, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" And he said, "No, I'm not. No, not me. Not me. I'm just with this crowd, not me." It says it was cold, and the servants and officials stood around the fire they had made to keep warm, and Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. John here tells the story in a very creative way. He cuts to another scene, like some film directors do. They'll cut from one scene and back and forth. So we have this scene of Peter in the courtyard, and one time he denies that he knows Jesus, and then, the scene cuts back to Jesus in this trial, but then it goes back to Peter. So it's kind of, John is drawing out this story of Peter, maybe to create this tension. Because you can, again, imagine Pilate going back and forth, and he's kind of desperate. And you can imagine Peter. He's at a very strange place. He's never been in this courtyard. You know, he didn't know anyone there, the other disciple there, and he's just standing with all these strangers who had also been part of arresting Jesus. And he's standing there warming his hands. And, you know, even for an extrovert, that would be hard. You know, me as an introvert, that'd be like, I wouldn't even be there. But there's Peter, you can imagine feeling a lot of internal tension, kind of curious what's going to happen to Jesus, maybe wanting to be a part, but also afraid. And here again, Peter is just not strong enough for the occasion. So John cuts back to the scene of Peter. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it, said, No, I'm not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. I mean, this had to have been scary for Peter, because, I mean, Peter remembers he had done something that could really get him into big trouble. And he's wondering, you know, am I next? Am I going to get arrested next? Because here's a guy who might really recognize not just that he's a disciple, but, wait, you're the guy who pulled out his sword. Didn't I see you there in the olive grove? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the rooster began to crow. The other Gospels tell us not just that Peter denied that he was the disciples, he denied that he even knew Jesus. I mean, he says, no, I don't even know that guy. Forget about Jesus. Who is he? Yeah, Jesus, nothing. I don't have anything to do with him. I've maybe heard of him. I don't know him. It also says in one of the other Gospels that Jesus cursed. You know, so he kind of used strong language to say whatever he said. Blank, no, I don't know that guy. Peter the sailor, you know, using a sailor's language. I don't know. So that's Peter. Again, in these two minds, he loves Jesus. I'm guessing that when those words are coming out of his mouth, no, I don't know him, in his heart is breaking, I imagine, which is why he went out and wept. That he really loved Jesus, but he just couldn't do the right thing. He didn't have the strength. He was still kind of double-minded. He was not yet single-minded. So there's Pilate, double-minded. There's Peter, double-minded. People who are living their lives in a very uncomfortable way. You know, no one reads this part of the story. No one reads John 18 and 19 and thinks Pilate was, well, he's an okay guy. No one finds any reason to respect Pilate. And in these chapters, no one finds any reason to respect Peter. None of you reading this story would think, yeah, I would take Peter's part in this story. None of you want Peter's part in that story. Certainly none of you want Pilate's part in that story. Thankfully, you know, probably no one in this room is much like Pilate. I dare say a lot of us have the temptation or have been tempted to be a little bit like Peter. I mean, I can think back to times when I could have been much more clear about who Jesus was to me. And I was conscious of being weak at that moment. And yet I still couldn't muster the strength to say what Jesus really meant to me. Thank God I'm not like Pilate, I don't think. But more often than not, I've been like Peter. But the good news, of course, is that Peter's story doesn't end. And we'll see more of the end of Peter's story next week. And the reason Peter's story doesn't end is because of the other character in the story, and that's Jesus. The one who did remain single-minded. If you remember previous sermons from the Gospel of John, for instance, John chapter 10, we didn't actually look at this last week when we looked at that chapter. Jesus, talking about himself, referred to himself as the one the Father sanctified and sent into the world. The one God set apart by sending him into the world. And I've made that point that in the Gospel of John, to be sanctified is to be sent into the world, to have a mission. Okay, to be holy is to be on mission. That's primarily what it means. And if you recall when we looked at John 17, Jesus says, I sanctify myself. And we spent a lot of time looking at what that meant. What does it mean for Jesus to make himself holy? I mean, he's the Son of God. Wasn't he always holy? Wasn't Jesus eternally holy? In a sense, yes. But primarily to be holy in this context is to be sent on mission. And so Jesus made himself holy by leaving heaven and becoming human, to be sent on mission. That's what it means to be set apart. This is why Jesus is doing this. He knows why he is there. He knows why he exists. He knows why he has to walk out toward that crowd. In the Gospel of Matthew, when it tells that part of the story, after Peter cuts off the guy's ear, and Jesus rebukes Peter, of all things, who actually showed a little bit of courage, not wise courage, but a little bit of courage. And Jesus there says, don't you understand? I could have called thousands of angels. I don't have to be arrested. I don't have to die. Jesus didn't have to do that. He could have rescued himself. He could have rescued himself. But that's not why he came. So that's what he actually tells Pilate in this dialogue with Pilate. Jesus essentially says over to Pilate, look, you're not really in control of this situation. I'm the one who's calling the shots, and this is happening to me because I'm here for this purpose. I am the master of this situation. And I'm standing here because this is the purpose that the Father sent me. You're just a pawn, a tool, so to speak, Pilate. And even those other people who had the worst guilt of arresting me and bringing me to you, they're just players in this game, but I'm fulfilling my destiny. Sorry, having technical problems. So Jesus is there on the cross. Later, as he's hanging on the cross, knowing that everything had now been finished, so that Scripture would be fulfilled. John has repeatedly said this. If you read this again, I was, just because my eyes were kind of looking for it, I was amazed again at just how often it says, this happened to fulfill Scripture. Sometimes it's a direct prophecy, but it's mainly just a way of saying what is happening now simply fits the pattern. Everything, all the little details, John is trying to communicate it. Look back at the story of God. Look at the entire story from the beginning. What's happening in Jesus, it fits the story. Jesus is simply accomplishing the story. He's fulfilling the story. In all these little details, there's all these pointers of what is happening in the life of Jesus. It fits. It's part of a plan. It's got a purpose. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is accidental in the life of Jesus. And so Jesus, knowing it's got to happen this way, he says, I'm thirsty. So a jar of wine vinegar was there, and they soaked a sponge in it. And they put it on a stalk of a plant and lifted it to Jesus' lips. And when he had received that, he said, it's finished. And with that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Of course, it's often pointed out how that's said. He gave up his spirit as if voluntarily. He didn't just die. He gave up his spirit. It's finished. I came for a purpose, and here it is. I came for this. He came to die. He knew it all along. He knew it all along. He knew this part of the story all along. He knew it for years. And he kept walking toward it single-mindedly. Peter's place in this part of the story doesn't end well. Next week, we'll see the turning and what's going to happen to Peter. But Peter's story is going to end well because of Jesus. Because Jesus fulfilled his purpose. Peter couldn't manage to be completely single-minded. But good news, Jesus was. Peter's story ends well. In spite of who Peter is, Peter's story ends well because of Jesus. Because what Jesus did, it's going to be okay with Peter. Your story can end equally well because of Jesus. I mean, at the beginning of the sermon, I talked a lot about Pilate and Peter and that double-mindedness. And when John is writing, this story, he's not mainly giving psychological advice about, it's important to be single-minded. I mean, that's true, but he's not like a counselor sitting down with Pilate and suggesting, ways for Pilate to cope better with life. Okay, John, as he tells this story, I mean, he does in creative ways present the story of Pilate and Peter, but he's mainly focusing on Jesus. Because Jesus' role in the story solves everything, establishes everything. Jesus' role in the story doesn't wipe out Peter's story. Jesus establishes Peter's story. Peter finds himself in the story of Jesus. And no matter who you are or what you've done, no matter how double-minded we have been, I mean, the good news is that literally in this room, for none of us is our story over. You're all alive. Good news, you're alive. Your story isn't over. And your story can be established because of the life of Jesus. I mean, think about this building. The story of this building isn't over. And who knows what's in light, what could happen in this building. Like I said at the beginning, people who built this building, they had no idea something like this would happen. They had no idea the Soviet Union was going to collapse and here would be a church in this building. They had their mind of what the story was going to be like, and they were all wrong. Absolutely wrong. Completely and utterly and eternally wrong how they thought that story was going to end. Jesus single-mindedly pursued his story and is continuing to win victories today. Again, here we are. And once again, for you, your story isn't over. Your story has life because Jesus gave his life. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for sending your Son. Thank you for your faithfulness to your plan and your purpose. Thank you, Jesus, for choosing to live out your role in the story, for saying yes to your Father's purpose. Thank you that you have called us into your story and that our stories live in your story. Thank you for this good news. Amen.